So what I really want to do in the next 7 or 8 minutes is to challenge the idea that land use intensification, and particularly forms of agricultural intensification, provide some simple blueprint for future sustainability and food security. I want to start with what we think we do know. So we know that land is a scarce commodity. We know it's becoming scarcer. We know that human numbers are growing and our appetites are growing even faster. Some project that demand for food crops could even double by the year 2050. At the same time as demand is growing, we know that some land is declining in its ability to produce food crops. There's soil degradation, climate change, problems with supplying water. And there's also greater competition for land. We know that we need more land for urban expansion. We need it for increasing our network of protected areas, for reforestation, perhaps for growing bioenergy crops. And this is a powerful nexus of problems. How are we as a society going to achieve security of food, energy, water in the face of changing climate in the future? So what is the solution, or rather what are the solutions to this nexus of problems? Well, we can think of 4 basic types. Firstly, we could reduce our demand for food by eating less, and by eating less meat in particular. Secondly, we could try to reduce waste. We know about 1/3 of food crops are lost post-harvest currently. And thirdly, we could redistribute, or distribute better, such that the needs and wants of the global elite are not gained at the expense of the global poor. And fourthly, we can do as we've done rather successfully in the past, we can grow more. We can grow more by expanding the area of land we grow food on, or perhaps better still, we can seek to grow more on the same area of land by increasing yields. We can do what we might call sustainable intensification, in which we increase yields whilst not increasing environmental impacts. And this, in a sense, is what the SDGs are calling for. SDG 2 calls for smallholders worldwide to double productivity by 2030, whilst SDG 15 calls on land use to be sustainable. Sustainable intensification. And this sounds great. This sounds like what we want, right? But now, the problem is, we've moved away from what we know. Now we're in the territory of what we don't know. Because we don't really know how to define or measure intensification, and we're certainly not realizing it in practice. So this is what we have set out to understand better. What is the performance of land use intensification? And it turns out that there are relatively few academic studies that study the impact of intensification both on human well-being and on environment. We found 61 cases. We've scrutinized those, and we've tried to identify whether they are indeed examples of sustainable intensification. So what have we found? Well, the headline finding is that we find relatively few cases that meet the criteria of a win for environment and a win for human well-being, 10 out of the 61. Bottom right-hand corner of that figure shows the most common case, which is where gains in human well-being from intensification are accompanied by losses in terms of ecosystems. But almost as common, bottom left-hand corner, are lose-lose cases in which attempts to intensify agricultural production in particular lead to negative outcomes not only for the environment but also for human well-being. We might say, well, at least we've identified 10 cases of win-win outcomes. And I'd love to be able to stand here and say, yes, I'm really confident that those 10 provide a model for the future that we can replicate, learn from, and scale up. But if I'm honest, I have to say that I'm not even confident that those 10 are necessarily clear examples of sustainable intensification, mainly because they tend to measure types of outcome which are more often positive, including food production, and they don't tend to measure outcomes which are less often positive, including impacts on biodiversity, on soils, and on water regulation. Okay, so what's going wrong here? Well, if we looked across our 61 cases, we'd find actually that it's a complex picture. There are many different trade-offs going on, and there are many different pathways towards those trade-offs. But I want to mention just two of these, which are perhaps most common. First off, we're seeing many cases of ecological trade-offs, in which provisioning and regulating ecosystem services are traded off against each other. In practice, this normally means that increases in food production are gained at the expense of decreases in some key regulating services, including services to water, pests, diseases, and soil quality. Secondly, we see social trade-offs in which wealthier groups invest and prosper from intensification, whilst the poor tend to lack the assets to actually participate and therefore get left behind. Exactly what the SDGs ask us not to do. And they not only get left behind, because they also suffer from the environmental impacts caused by their wealthier neighbours who are investing in intensification. So it's a kind of double whammy for them. So what do we do? Well, first off, as I started out, we must not assume that intensification of agricultural production is an easy blueprint to our problems. And we shouldn't assume that it relieves us of the need to pursue some of the other options, including changing our consumption habits and redistributing. We must not leave behind the poor, and at a minimum, we should be considering some kind of safety nets to ensure that they don't lose out from these interventions. And finally, we should be measuring the things that we really need to measure, not just food production and income, but also some of the wider and longer-term environmental impacts from these interventions. Thank you.